Now, I did count. There are actually only 4 images of food in this book, but they're all food as a part of a portrait. But I think that's really good because that means that we're getting outside our comfort zone. We're looking at things from a different perspective, right? What's shaking, bacon? I'm Joni Simon. Welcome to my studio. This is where I do food photography, and I love to make learning food photography easier so that you can create images that you love. And so today we are continuing on in the Bite Shop Book Club with a focus on composition, because this month's book is Mastering Composition by Richard Garvey Williams. So last week we talked about balance, the idea of creating equilibrium in an image, and maybe you put some of those things into play, but you're like, still something not quite right with my image. Well, there's a lot of multifaceted components dealing with composition, and one of the big ones is understanding how we create lines in our image in order to direct the viewer's eyes throughout the image and ultimately to our subject, and to hopefully also keep them inside the image so they don't just look at it and run away. So how do we create a line? Well, there can certainly be literal lines in an image. For example, this Swiss chart here, you can see that those red stems, those are lines, and you can see how they kind of crisscross each other, and what I think is an interesting pattern and makes for a kind of chaotic but at the same time sort of peaceful composition. But certainly not all of our compositions in images contain such literal lines. They have what Garvey Williams refers to as optical lines. They're sort of implied lines, because as he goes through in this book, that the way that we see images as a viewer is that we process them psychologically, and we refer to that psychology and that theory as Gestalt theory. And so one of the components of Gestalt theory is that when we're looking at an image with various elements in it, if we are able to perceive a relationship between the various elements, that we will in essence connect the dots, and it's the connecting of those dots where we start to form lines. So let's go ahead and go through a couple examples. So with these citrus here, and you're like, why is this image in black and white? Don't worry, I promise this will make sense in a second. That just looking at this image, it feels very random, but the second that we add the color to it, then suddenly we understand and we can start to see lines. That lines emerge visually to us so that we sort of organize the image mentally to understand what's going on. And so because of the orientation of the colors, then we see that there's a diagonal line going from the upper right down to the lower left, because of that little path of the connection of those blood oranges, that they are a different color, a very vibrant color, in contrast then to all the other citrus that's in the image. But then we get kind of this secondary little line, which is sort of a curved line with those lemons in the yellow, and then the green is sort of interspersed and kind of in between. But a great way to define a line in an image is with the use of color. Another way that we can connect the dots for our viewer and create lines is by applying similarity of shape. So for example, in this image, we have very similar shapes in terms of there's a lot of circles going on in this image. And so certainly we have all those little radishes, those are watermelon radishes out of my garden. I'm so excited, they just came out of the ground. But we see those as all connected sort of in that horizontal line. But you can also see that we're dealing with some diagonal lines. If we all of a sudden look at kind of the relationship of those various circles, that you can see that it's creating this really nice sort of diagonal pattern, and our eye really enjoys patterns, that it's helping direct our eye and move our eye back and forth through that image, looking at the various items, but in an organized way that doesn't feel chaotic. And so then when I went to go place that knife, it only made sense then, it felt most natural for that to fall in line along with the diagonals that were already established in the image. These are the principles that are in play, is really understanding what are the lines that you're creating in the image, whether that's with application of color or that's application of shape. And then there's one other way that's really helpful, especially in food photography, to create lines, and that's just through similarity of type. So for example, if we go into this image of these toasts, and this image might look familiar. It's the thumbnail to this video, but just in terms of what we have here, we see the continuity, the line that is created mentally and that is created because of the similarity between the toasts. Now, they're not all exact carbon copies of one another. I arranged the radishes and the blood oranges and the mint a little differently on all of them, but because they have similar components to them, they're similar in terms of color and shape and form, our eye sees them as related and connects the dots for us, creating that just nice horizontal line across the bottom of the image. But when it comes to food, it's not just about arranging the various elements, it's also about looking at the food itself and the lines that exist in the food. And so, for example, we have this blood orange that's close up. I mean, this was just like speaking to me as I was doing that bigger overhead of all the citrus, and I saw this blood orange and just that sparkle factor, and oh, I just gotta do a close-up of that. So threw on the macro lens, got this picture right here. But you can see there's actually diagonals created in this image from that upper right to the lower left, and that is thanks to that little center area. You see where it's kind of open, where the segments all come together in the center, but there is a very kind of overt, or at least I read it as an overt diagonal that is created by that open space between the segments that then draws our eye diagonally across this image. So it is important, just as you're starting to plate things up, start to pay attention to. That's also the mark of a really good food stylist, is somebody who understands angles and direction and movement, because by incorporating these various kinds of lines, we're able to express certain feelings. And so, as talked about in the book, for example, horizontal lines give us a real feeling of harmony, of balance, of calm. So you can see these toasts again, it's very sort of serene. And that's complemented certainly by the color palette and the styling and a lot of other choices. But just in terms of those lines, if your dominant line is horizontal, that's going to create a feeling of harmony and peace in your image, as opposed to vertical lines, which we see here in this image. You can see we've got very strong verticals going on here. And in general, those verticals will give you a sense that it's assertive and it's direct. There's a feeling of height and grandeur. So depending on your subject, what you're trying to communicate, vertical lines might really be the way to go. And then of course there are diagonal lines, which I feel like we talk a lot about when we're referencing composition, but it is important to understand that verticals are very helpful just in terms of creating energy and movement, because just the way that they're directed helps move our eye more quickly through an image. It creates more energy for the viewer. And then the other kind of line, which he briefly touches on in here, but you'll see a ton in food photography, are curved lines. And I think this is mostly due to the fact that, you know, you think of food and it's all coming in sort of these organic forms. The idea of, you know, rounded apples and irregular shaped pizzas, and it's not necessarily square forms. And so by incorporating those curves, that integrates very naturally with food. Now, I've heard various opinions as it relates to incorporating curved lines. And I don't think there's a right or wrong. Like we've said that before here on this channel, you do what makes you happy, and the images that speak to you and your creativity go nuts. But in terms of the way that I do it, I really like to utilize curved lines as sort of the visual garnish, not the actual garnish, but the idea that the primary lines in the image will either be horizontal, vertical, or most often with me, diagonal, but then I'll incorporate some sort of curve to complement that. So for example, if we look at the image, we go back to those toasts, we can see that the primary line that's created, the strongest line in the image, is the connection of those toasts, because they're the most vibrant, they're the largest, it's the kind of the most overt and obvious line that's created. So that's the horizontal. But if you look at the green items in the image, we can see the relationship there. We start to connect those visual dots. And so you can see we've got the green there in the upper right, that kind of dominant frond coming out of the upper right. And you can see just the direction of that stem sort of like shoots us off to the left side, just slightly curved. And then that picks up then with those little pieces of mint that are hanging out there in the back. And then that curves us around the front, kind of brings us around what to me is the primary toast, right? We've got all those toasts are related, but that center one is the most important. And so that green line sort of hugs the side of that center toast and then swipes around to the front and then brings us back up to the toast on the left. And that's creating a curve, you could say an S curve, that's intertwined then with that major primary horizontal line that's created. Because if the greens weren't there, chances are our eye would just sort of scan between those three toasts, see that as horizontal in a pattern, and then kind of get bored and peace out. Whereas the incorporation of the green creates sort of this little sort of wave movement for us, and it moves us back and forth through the image, adding just a bit more interest, a bit more energy, and hopefully keeping the viewer around longer. But now the tricky part is the next time you sit down and you're like, all right, I got all these lines, right? We've got horizontals, verticals, diagonals, curves. Which one should I use and apply? And can I use different ones? Well, what I would say, especially just starting out as you're starting to experiment with the concept of lines, is keep it simple. Don't go overboard with your lines, because more lines can just add more confusion. Certainly, there are beautiful images that have many lines and many aspects going on, but just as you're starting to get used to it and get used to the concept, feel free to keep it simple. But I would say the other thing you can do too, and what I have found to be one of the most helpful things for building my own personal eye as I attack my own work, is by looking at the work of other people, especially those who I love and those images that I just go, oh, it's so captivating, and I get stuck in them, is to really look at the lines, observe the lines that are in those. Where are they incorporating curves? Where do they have really strong, verticals or horizontals or diagonals? Really start to diagnose those things, so that then the next time you go into a shoot, you'll be like, I just really want to create a diagonal that felt like that, or an image that feels strong like that. And you'll have a few more tools then in your tool belt in order to execute that image. And so what we're going to do next time, continuing along on the topic of composition here with Richard Garvey Williams, and we're going to take it one step even further and hopefully start to pull all of these things together, because that's the thing with composition, that you can't really take these various theories and concepts and just put one of them into practice and have a great image, that they're really also interdependent on one another. So we're going to bring it all together, we're going to hammer it home, and then two, if you're not already, be sure to get on the Bite Shop Book Club email list, because for the fourth and final week, to round it all out, I'm going to incorporate you and your images and have you guys interact with me here live on YouTube. And so thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Hopefully you learned a thing or two. I hope you have a fantastic week. You stay out of trouble. I will see you next time, okay? Bye.